In this episode, we're going to look at why defenders rarely win by watching only one kind of security data, even if that one source feels comprehensive. Security incidents are stories, and stories are hard to understand when you only hear one witness, because every witness sees a different angle and misses different details. Some data sources tell you what attackers are doing in the world, some tell you what weaknesses exist inside your environment, and others tell you what is actually happening right now on your systems. The skill you're building here is not memorizing tools, but learning how to combine signals so you can make stronger decisions with less guessing. You'll hear about threat feeds, scans, and bug bounties as ways to learn what might hit you and where you might already be exposed. You'll also learn how cloud security posture management, CSPM, logs, and data loss prevention, DLP, contribute different kinds of evidence that help you confirm what matters and what doesn't. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. As you move from beginner to capable defender, you start thinking in terms of coverage, meaning whether your data sources collectively observe the paths attackers actually use. Attackers don't limit themselves to one layer, so defenders can't either, because the gap between layers is where attacks hide. If you only watch network activity, you might miss identity misuse that never triggers obvious network patterns. If you only watch endpoint events, you might miss cloud misconfigurations that create exposure without any malware at all. If you only watch alerts, you might miss quiet preparation steps like reconnaissance or account setup that happen before the noisy part begins. The goal of diverse data sources is to reduce blind spots by combining different viewpoints, like combining a map, a weather report, and a traffic report before a trip. Each source can be wrong sometimes, but when several sources point in the same direction, you gain confidence. This episode is about learning what each source is good at and how to connect them into a clearer defensive picture. Threat feeds are one of the most common data sources beginners hear about, and they often sound like a list of bad things to block. At a high level, a threat feed is information about known malicious or suspicious indicators, such as addresses, domains, file hashes, or patterns associated with attacker infrastructure and activity. The value is that feeds help you learn what is showing up elsewhere, so you can be ready before it shows up in your environment. The limitation is that feeds can be noisy, outdated, or too generic, and they can create a false sense of security if you treat them as complete protection. A defender uses feeds as hints, not as proofs, and asks how those hints should influence monitoring and response priorities. Another beginner misunderstanding is thinking a feed is a prediction of what will happen to you, when it is really a description of what has been observed in other places. The practical skill is deciding which feed items matter for your environment and what you will do when you see them. To incorporate threat feeds safely, you need to think about relevance and reliability, because not all feed entries deserve equal trust or equal urgency. Relevance means whether the indicator matches your technology stack, your geography, your business relationships, and your exposure patterns, because an indicator tied to a service you never use may not matter. Reliability means whether the feed item is likely to represent true malicious activity rather than an error, a temporary reassignment, or a benign system that was misclassified. You also need to understand that indicators can change because attacker infrastructure rotates and because some network addresses are reused by different parties over time. That makes timing important, because an indicator seen months ago might not represent the same risk today. A helpful mindset is to treat feeds as prioritization inputs that guide what you search for and what you investigate, not as a substitute for observing your own environment. When you tie a feed indicator to local evidence from logs or telemetry, it becomes much more actionable. Scanning is a different kind of data source because it is not about what attackers did elsewhere, but about what weaknesses exist inside your own environment. A scan is an assessment that looks for vulnerabilities, missing patches, risky configurations, exposed services, and other conditions that could be exploited. Scanning helps you answer, where are we likely to get hurt if someone tries, and how urgent is the fix? Beginners sometimes assume scanning is a one-time safety check, but scanning is more like checking the health of a complex machine, because new issues appear as systems change. Another misunderstanding is assuming scans always tell the truth, when scan results can include false positives and blind spots depending on what can be reached and what credentials are available. Scans are also snapshots, meaning they tell you what was true when the scan ran, not necessarily what is true right now. Still, scans are invaluable because they reveal exposures you can fix before an attacker finds them. Incorporating scan data into your monitoring mindset helps you prioritize alerts involving vulnerable systems because those systems have a higher likelihood of becoming incident starting points. The most useful way to connect scan results to defense is to treat them as risk context for everything else you see. If an alert fires on a system that scanning says is missing a critical update, that alert should feel more urgent because the attacker might have an easier path to success. If you see suspicious probing against a service that scanning says is exposed publicly, that is a sign to verify that exposure is truly intended and protected. If a scan highlights weak authentication or misconfiguration on a key system, you can adjust monitoring to look for abuse patterns that align with that weakness. Beginners often treat scanning as a compliance activity, but defenders treat scanning as a predictive lens that shows where attackers will likely push. Another practical point is that scan results can help reduce false positives, because you can deprioritize certain detections on systems that don't even have the relevant software. When you incorporate scanning intelligently, you stop treating every system as equally risky, and that is a major step toward mature prioritization. Bug bounties are another data source that can confuse beginners, because they sound like something separate from normal security operations. A bug bounty is a program where external researchers report vulnerabilities to an organization, usually under rules that protect both the researcher and the organization. Even if an organization doesn't run a formal bounty, the broader idea of vulnerability disclosure still exists, meaning outsiders may find issues and report them. The security value is that bounties and disclosures can reveal blind spots that internal teams missed, especially on public-facing assets where external perspectives matter. The limitation is that the reported issues vary widely in severity and quality, and not every report represents real risk in your specific context. Beginners sometimes assume bounty findings are automatically critical because someone outside found them, but seriousness depends on exploitability, exposure, and impact. Another misunderstanding is thinking bounties replace internal security testing, when they are better seen as an extra net that catches things in the messy real world. Incorporating bounty and disclosure data means treating external findings as valuable signals to validate, prioritize, and fix, while also learning what patterns of mistakes keep recurring. When you use bounty and disclosure information well, you gain more than a single fix, because you gain insight into systemic weaknesses in how systems are built and managed. If multiple reports point to similar misconfigurations, that suggests a baseline or template problem rather than a one-off mistake. If reports repeatedly involve authentication flows or access control logic, that suggests your design reviews need stronger focus in that area. Bounty findings also help calibrate your monitoring, because a discovered vulnerability can become a detection objective, meaning you want to watch for exploitation attempts or suspicious probing against the affected component. A beginner-friendly way to see this is that a bounty report is like a fire inspector pointing to a hazard. You don't just fix that one hazard, you ask what process allowed it to exist. Incorporating bounties into defense therefore connects to both prevention and detection, because you fix the root cause and you watch for abuse while the fix is rolled out. This combination reduces the chance that a known issue becomes an active incident during the remediation window. Cloud Security Posture Management, CSPM, is a data source category that specifically addresses a modern reality. Cloud environments change rapidly, and misconfigurations can create exposure without any malware or exploitation in the traditional sense. CSPM focuses on identifying risky cloud settings, such as overly permissive access, publicly exposed resources, weak identity policies, and missing security controls. The value is that CSPM helps you find security drift, meaning the gradual shift away from intended secure baselines as new services are deployed and settings are modified. Beginners sometimes assume cloud providers automatically secure everything, but cloud security is shared, and configuration choices made by the organization can create serious risk. Another misunderstanding is thinking CSPM only matters for audits, when it is actually a form of continuous defensive reconnaissance against your own environment. CSPM findings can highlight where attackers might enter through cloud access paths, where data might be exposed, and where identity permissions might allow lateral movement. Incorporating CSPM data helps defenders prioritize both remediation and monitoring by focusing attention on the riskiest cloud configurations. The reason CSPM fits into monitoring and response is that posture issues often explain why certain alerts matter more than others. If an identity alert shows unusual access to a cloud resource, and CSPM shows that resource has permissive access controls, the risk increases because the attacker has a larger blast radius once inside. If you see outbound data movement, and CSPM shows missing encryption or weak access boundaries on storage, that suggests a higher chance of real data exposure. CSPM can also identify missing logging or missing security features, which is itself an observability risk because you can't investigate what you never recorded. Beginners sometimes treat cloud posture and incident detection as separate worlds, but defenders connect them because posture is the environment's weakness profile and detection is the environment's behavior profile. When posture and behavior align in a suspicious way, confidence increases. The practical mindset is that CSPM tells you where the doors might be open, while logs tell you whether someone walked through them. That combination is how you turn configuration data into actionable defense. Logs remain the most universal data source because they are direct records of what systems claim happened, and they are the foundation for building timelines. Logs can come from authentication systems, endpoints, servers, network devices, applications, and cloud platforms, and each type answers different questions. Identity logs tell you who attempted access and whether it succeeded, which is essential for tracing account misuse. Endpoint and server logs tell you what executed, what changed, and what persisted, which helps confirm whether access became control. Application logs tell you what actions were taken inside business logic, which often defines real impact like data access and changes. Beginners sometimes assume logs are naturally reliable, but log quality depends on collection, parsing, time synchronization, and protection from tampering. Logs are also plentiful, which means the challenge is not getting more, but getting the right logs and making them usable. Incorporating logs effectively requires thinking about what questions you need to answer during an incident and ensuring the data exists to answer them. A defender's approach to logs is to treat them as evidence that must be correlated, not as isolated messages to stare at. A single log event might be benign, but a sequence across identity, endpoint, and application layers can show a clear pattern of intrusion and movement. Logs also become more valuable when you can compare them to baselines, because the same action can be normal for one account and abnormal for another. Another beginner misunderstanding is thinking that if you have logging turned on, you are done, when in reality you need to validate that logs are complete, consistent, and retained long enough to support investigation. You also need to protect the integrity of critical logs, because attackers often try to erase traces once they gain control. When logs are centralized and protected, they can preserve truth even when endpoints are compromised. Incorporating logs as a primary data source means designing monitoring as a storytelling system, where each log type plays a role in explaining how an incident unfolded. Data loss prevention, DLP, adds a different lens because it focuses on the movement and exposure of sensitive information rather than on malware or exploitation directly. DLP systems aim to detect and sometimes prevent sensitive data from leaving approved boundaries, such as being emailed externally, uploaded to unapproved destinations, copied to removable media, or shared in risky ways. The value is that DLP is close to business impact because it directly relates to confidentiality loss, which is often the most painful outcome. Beginners sometimes think DLP is only for catching insiders, but it is also useful for detecting compromised accounts that begin exfiltrating data or for catching accidental sharing mistakes. Another misunderstanding is thinking DLP is perfect at identifying sensitive data, when in reality classification and detection can be hard, and false positives can be common without careful tuning. Still, DLP provides crucial context because it can reveal what data was at risk, which helps determine severity and response priority. Incorporating DLP data helps defenders focus on what matters most, whether sensitive information is actually being exposed. DLP becomes especially powerful when you correlate it with other signals, because data movement rarely happens in isolation during real incidents. If an identity log shows a suspicious login and a short time later DLP detects unusual data transfer attempts, that correlation strengthens the case for rapid containment. If an endpoint alert indicates a compromise and DLP shows no sensitive data movement, the incident may still be serious, but the containment strategy and urgency might differ. DLP also helps with tuning and reducing false positives by teaching you which data patterns are truly sensitive in your environment and which activities are normal business operations. For beginners, it helps to think of DLP as a boundary alarm around valuable information, similar to a sensor on a museum door, where the goal is to detect and stop valuable items from leaving without permission. Like other sensors, it needs context, because some movement is legitimate, such as approved sharing to a partner. Incorporating DLP means connecting data sensitivity to monitoring decisions so severity reflects potential harm, not just technical curiosity. The biggest win from incorporating diverse data sources is that you can move from single-signal reactions to multi-signal decisions, which reduces both missed attacks and wasted effort. Threat feeds might tell you which attacker infrastructure is active, scans tell you which systems are most vulnerable, bounties tell you what outsiders can reach and exploit, CSPM tells you where cloud configurations create exposure, logs tell you what actually happened, and DLP tells you whether sensitive information moved in risky ways. When those signals converge, you can act faster and with more confidence, because you are not relying on one imperfect sensor. When signals conflict, you can investigate the gap, which often reveals data quality issues or coverage holes that you can fix. Beginners sometimes assume more data automatically means better defense, but the key is purposeful integration, meaning you decide what each source is for and how it influences triage and response. Integration also helps you prioritize remediation work, because multiple sources can point to the same high-risk weakness. A defender's mindset is to build a layered evidence system where each source compensates for the other's limitations. To conclude, incorporating diverse data sources is one of the most practical ways to become a stronger defender because it turns security from guesswork into evidence-based reasoning. Threat feeds expand your awareness of external danger. Scans reveal internal weaknesses that attackers will target. Bounties and disclosures provide real-world feedback on what outsiders can find. CSPM exposes cloud misconfigurations and drift. Logs provide the timeline of what occurred, and DLP highlights where sensitive data may be leaving safe boundaries. None of these sources is perfect, and each can create noise if used without context, which is why the real skill is correlation and prioritization rather than collection alone. When you connect these sources thoughtfully, you get earlier warnings, clearer investigations, and fewer blind spots for attackers to exploit. The core beginner takeaway is that good defense is not about having one brilliant sensor. It is about building a set of complementary viewpoints that together explain what is happening and what matters most. That is how you make monitoring meaningful and response confident, even in complex environments.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.